We're really glad you're here with us today for our second part of our public health training, climate change and public health training. And today we're going to be focusing on the co-benefits of public health climate change action, as well as how we respond and how we work on this at a local government level through integration of public health into planning documents such as climate action plans and general plans. And we have two speakers with us today who are going to give us some context on these issues. But before we go to that, we're going to revisit our activity from last time. Unfortunately, Elizabeth is not able to join us today.
No, Brooke.
Brooke, I'm sorry, Brooke. Whew. I was off to a good start. Elizabeth is sitting right here. Brooke is not able to join us today, and so I'm going to be filling in as the stand-in for her for this report back and elevator activity. So what we're going to do is we're going to have different team members, and we're going to start with the Sacramento team, give us their elevator pitches, and then we'll have a little bit of feedback on each of these so we can see what people did with their various approaches to doing elevator pitches. And I think we have a few people teed up: Katie Ward, Aldrin and Michelle, Eric Cohen, Olivia Hara. If other folks want to do this activity, please raise your hand or on the webinar or send a note through the chat. And I should mention before we dive in some of the general logistics for a webinar. You all are muted, so talking doesn't do any good at us, so use the electronic functions to communicate. We can unmute you as appropriate when you do the elevator pitch or if there's a question, but use the raising hand function or use the question box to type your questions. And we are recording this, so if you know one of your team members is not able to attend, we will be making it available at a later date. So now as we dive in, who's going to go first from Sacramento? All right. Make sure you stand up and talk loudly.
Okay. So this is Ariadna and Melanie from the Sacramento region. And so one of the projects here in Sacramento is with the Sacramento Tree Foundation. So for our elevator pitch, we decided to try and target one of the communities that we will potentially be working with, which is the Mian community.
So this area that we're focusing on in South Sacramento has a composition of 50% Asians, where 27% of them are comprised of Hmong and Mian ethnic groups that originated from southern China, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. We decided that the best way to target these communities who may not be proficient in English or interact with people outside of their community would be to work closely with the Asian community groups who have already established a presence in the area and developed some good relationships with community members and other community organizations in the area. And so one of which is the UMIN Community Services Group, which has extensive partnerships with agencies going from SMUD to the California Endowment to more local associations such as the Hmong Women's Heritage Association and various Asian supermarkets, and are also supported by congresswomen and other legislators in the Sacramento region. They also offer peer-run programs for seniors and youth, as well as host their own radio program in Sacramento. And so we've sort of composed a strategy rather than an elevator pitch for this group, and studies have shown that compared to other race and ethnicities, Asian communities tend to see trees as more of a problem than a solution, because the care and maintenance of trees tend to add another burden for their household chores and expenses. And so due to the high risk of urban heat island effect in this particular area, we wanted to defeat this stigma and integrate a tree planting initiative / program with the organization.
So our strategy for outreaching to this community would be maybe creating a poster, which we could then post up in the organization's location so that people who come in and out of that organization could have access to kind of see what the benefits would be. So on this poster, we would talk about the benefits of trees to health to this community, which could be reducing pollutants in the air, since tree foliage can capture particulate matter, and then it could also prevent or decrease the likelihood of heat strokes for the elderly members in this community, since trees decrease the urban heat island effect in the area by providing shade and cooling the surrounding locations. And it could also provide a place for meditation and exercise, since people are more likely to go outside when there's more trees, so it could help people go out and exercise more, just meditate, and it can also reduce stress. Some studies have shown that trees reduce stress, so it could just help the community live a healthier life. And then there's also social benefits such as beautifying the community, bringing the community together and creating social space, since more people, if they want to go out to a park or just hang out outside their homes, there's trees where they can go and sit in the shade. And it also creates an environment for learning, since the youth groups in this area can go to tree planting events and help maintain these trees so that they can give back to the community. And it could also decrease crime rates, since there's more people out on the streets for social gatherings, etc. There's less of a likelihood of people breaking into homes or being out and about doing things they shouldn't be. So that would be our strategy for communicating towards this community.
That's great. Our work is done. We can all just go on to next.
Comments, feedback?
Yeah, I always this is an interesting challenge, especially in many immigrant communities actually have really good lifestyle behaviors that they're bringing in. They have a certain level of resilience already. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of an interesting challenge telling people who may have good dietary habits or physical activity that they have to do more. So the focus on other things that are of interest to the community is, you got to find, I think some of the communication strategies that Brooke was talking about, make it personal, make it local, make it, sort of matter to, the family structures of, the people who are being affected are not, out in multi-generations in the future. They're our kids. Mm-hmm. Because, immigrant communities often have very strong family values. I don't know if that would resonate more. The other thing I was curious about is just what air conditioning ownership is in that community. I mean, poor communities often don't have much lower air conditioning ownership, and whether, even though I learned something right now, that I realized that trees have an element of stigma, which I think is really, really important. This is what you learn when you actually work with the communities, the things that the dominant culture thinks is like that should be the norm. You wind up finding out that's not always the case. Mm-hmm. But whether other appeals around, this is like a natural air conditioner, it'll lower, the temperature in your home if it's planted properly, mm-hmm. rather than limbs falling on the house or representing a threat, and whether it would save money because these are low-income communities that will be spending a disproportionate amount of their energy bill on cooling during emergency, during excessive heat days, whether that could also be a point of appeal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of what we've talked about before, but for this specific one, we're just trying to aim more towards the health side rather than energy efficiency, but that is one of the main points we have.
Well, the health connection is when you make more resources available, more economic resources available for families, then that actually promotes health. And there's a very strong income mortality relationship. Mm-hmm. So there is that other health loop, more general health loop. I'll talk a bit about that as a review, but I don't want to talk too much.
I thought it was also really interesting and really great that you picked up on that cultural difference. I think that's one of the biggest things whenever you're doing any projects like this is where does the community stand on this? If it's something that they're going to embrace, something they're not going to embrace. So that was really interesting, and I thought great to pick up. The other piece that I thought was great was the multi-generational piece of really thinking, I think it's one of those things where you could actually bring in people from different backgrounds. The one piece I was going to add would be really powerful is to actually test some of those theories out before with the community, maybe even having them inform, like through focus group, on designing the messaging and designing the posters and getting feedback on what would really make sense. But community in partnership with some established relationships was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
All right. Next up.
Okay, so this is Emily, Laura, and Shelby. We are taking a slightly different strategy. We're going to be doing a skit for you all. We're working in the same community that Melanie just described, but we're going to be directing this towards the school. So Census Tract has one elementary school with the same demographics that Melanie described, and from working with the Sacramento Tree Foundation, they've found that some of their greatest success has been working through the elementary or the middle schools and going to the students, and then using the students as a point to go home and talk to their parents about getting trees and expand from there, or even the neighbors who live close to the school see that others have trees and they want them too, so that it's a good point of expansion. So we decided that we'd direct an educational skit to made up fourth graders for this school. So
Are we the fourth graders?
you can participate as a fourth grader. Please do. Participation is, yeah, preferred. Everyone can participate.
So the skit begins with showing the students some images of their school. Some images will be parts of their campus that are purely cement/blacktop, and with little or no presence of trees. In contrast, there will be photos of parts of their campus that have trees bearing shade. The presenter, Emily, will ask the students to think about how they feel when they see these images. Going back and forth between these contrasting images, they will be asked to clap or to jump up and down, showing which photo they like better. Afterwards, students will be asked to explain what it is about the photos they like better. Ideally, the discussion will lead to trees.
Okay, so I will start us off. Jumping right into it. So, class, did you know that trees have a big impact on our lives? Some people may think, oh, they're just trees, we just walk past them, but they really help us. We're going to do an activity that helps us think about all the ways trees make our environment a healthier place. First off, clap if you like trees. Okay, everyone, if you have ever waited under the shade of a tree before your parents picked you up from school, clap your hands. If you have ever burned yourself when playing on the hot playground, clap your hands. That's great. Did you know that trees provide an excellent source of shade? On a hot day, shade blocks direct sunlight and solar radiation. This can feel like 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit less than what you're actually feeling in direct sunlight. Through a process called evapotranspiration, trees actually help to cool the air. The more trees, the stronger the effect. In this way, trees help to keep the areas you spend time at cooler. If you have ever felt relaxed looking at a tree, clap your hands. Yes, green views and access to green space like areas where there are trees has proven to help people cope with stress. This is good for your mental health and for your blood pressure. Trees also help you to concentrate, which is important when you want to pay attention in class. If you have ever gotten really hot running around on the blacktop at recess, clap your hands. Did you know that black surfaces like the pavement of the schoolyard absorb radiation from the sun? This increases the temperature and makes you more tired when you are running around. Shading the pavement with trees helps to keep the pavement you run on cooler. It also helps to reduce the temperature in our city. If you or your friends have ever had trouble breathing at recess or have had to use an asthma inhaler, clap your hands. Trees help to clean the air we breathe. They absorb the bad gases that cause air pollution, and they also help to take dirty particles out of the air so that you don't have to breathe them into your body. This reduces pollution and makes it easier for all of us to breathe clean air. If you have ever seen an animal that lives in a tree, clap your hands. Yes, many animals call trees their habitat. Trees provide protection, a source of food, and a place to rest for many animals in our city, such as the birds and squirrels. So trees are important to their well-being, too. Wow, it seems like you guys know a lot about trees. Do you think it's a good idea to plant more trees at your school?
Yes.
Yeah. Well trained.
I'm going to tell my mom all about this when I get home. I want to plant a tree at home, too.
I like trees a lot better now. I didn't know that they could help me breathe better when I'm at school.
The end.
Great. Well, as a pediatrician, I love it. I think a couple things. I think it was really fun having them look at photos and talk about it. But one thing that can be really fun is having them take their own photos. And it can be a great way to take photos with your parents. So it's a type of project called Photo Voice, which we've done before and can be really fun and powerful because they're actually sharing their own story. I think some of the things for fourth graders, you have to depend on the class of who you're doing the skit with. Some of the stuff might be a little high for them.
Yeah.
Evapotranspiration.
Yeah, I knew that one was a tough one, but still remember.
But you can do those with pictures.
Yeah. it would have more explanation in between. This is a sped up version.
Yeah.
Maybe because I'm kind of a science nerd and I would be like an 8th grader crashing the 4th grader class. I liked how you wove the technical stuff that made it sound fun to the presentation. So, communication is sort of an interesting thing because it's as much the nonverbal stuff as much as the verbal stuff that matters. So in this kind of setting, to really get the kids excited, even if they don't know what evapotranspiration is, if they hear the words and these other things, it will prepare for, you don't want to totally make them confused, but the point is that I think, this attempt to try to get some of the science stuff in there, I have other interests because for school-age kids, science and technology, engineering, we have a big problem in this country of not attracting enough people to this arena. So making science accessible to kids the way you did it, I think, is just a good hook. So we need more of that kind of thing to get kids, excited about science and things like that. So I think it meets multiple objectives, that kind of approach you've done. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I'll just say one quick thing, which is in my last job, one of the questions we asked almost every candidate was to explain the science of climate change as if you were talking to an elementary school student, because you find out a lot about what people know, how they can communicate based on the trying and whether they can actually step out of their head and pretend to be speaking to a different audience. So I really applaud that you guys sort of made that your frame. So I think we probably have time for just one more, maybe two, depending on how fast they are. Is Katie available? Excellent. Katie, can you hear us?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, you get the disadvantage, maybe, or advantage of actually just having your voice to work with. So a slightly different approach to communication when it's just your words. Is this her?
Yes.
Are you?
She can now
the graphic?
see the graphic.
Okay, so we're all looking at the graphic that you shared with us, I think.
Okay, great.
Turn it over to you.
All right, so we made a flyer because we just wanted to communicate that way. And what we're doing is we're working, our project is doing residential energy assessments for people to kind of help them learn about energy efficiency by making it more simple and stuff like that. So we took this approach. So the flyer is basically an elevator pitch in of itself. So I can just read it because that's basically like what we came up with it. We just wanted to make it more visual. So basically it's saving energy saves you more than just money. And while we're incredibly fortunate to live in Southern California, this region is especially vulnerable to effects of climate change. Climate change is impacting more than just the weather. It can also cause poor human health conditions like asthma, heart disease, respiratory illness, and more. Energy production in Southern California is contributing to climate change, so using less electricity and natural gas will not only keep the environment healthy, but also keep you healthier. As an extra bonus, you'll save money on energy bills. So be energy-wise and be health-wise. And basically, we try to incorporate all the elements, like the personal, we're trying to get people's wallets, so and that makes people think about things a little bit more when you're doing that. And also, I guess, just the value of people value their health a lot of times, so kind of connecting that to energy and climate change in one is also kind of difficult. So this exercise was helpful in the sense that we can't always mention climate change when we're talking to people about energy because they get kind of controversial. So we try to take that approach. It's kind of nice to have this activity because it kind of gives a more positive look, and it's not super negative or anything. So
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, this is, what Brooke was mentioning last time is that when a health message is coupled with the climate change message, it tends to increase the receptivity of who the target audience is. So I think what you've done here is precisely that. You led with the health message, and by the way, it saves you money. I think that's precisely the kind of thing that Brooke was talking about. And again, there's a lot of social research that backs up that particular approach. So it's not just someone's an expert's opinion. It really is a pathway to reach people. And as you implied, this would have to be followed up with other activities so that it's not just a one-off deal, that it's part of a broader communication strategy. So congratulations, that's great.
Yeah, and I think it's great. It's really a quick read. The icons are nice. They'll stick in people's heads. I think it's also catchy. The be energy wise, be health wise. So I think it's a really good message.
Yeah, great job. And these guys are doing a lot of actual direct engagement on this topic out in the community, so they're going to get that firsthand experience, whether some of these messages work and what other messages might work.
Yeah, I was curious if you guys have gone so far to think about an actual dissemination strategy, or is that sort of a little bit too much to push on? To actually take this kind of poster or imaging, it could wind up on buses, it could wind up on telephone poles, it could wind up any number of places where people, rec centers, where people are congregating. Community-based organizations can take these and distribute them. So there's all kinds of venues. I don't know. That might be the next step.
I think they are, aren't you guys?
No, this is just for the activity.
Oh, okay. Well, they're doing this whole point of permit outreach campaign, and so that has a whole bunch of
for the project. Sorry, I misunderstood.
I think we're saying it's good enough to go to the next stage. So.
Take it and run.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you guys could talk to Marissa and all about having a health aspect to the marketing campaign.
Or do a little pilot. That might be more realistic to fine tune it and other things like that. It probably needs to be in multiple languages and other things too. But anyway, great.
Thank you guys. So we'll do one more, and because this is really fun. We have Aldrin Carrion. I'm probably butchering your name, Aldrin. Oh, you've muted yourself, Aldrin, so unless you unmute your own phone, we're not going to be able to bring you online. Who is next down the list? Michelle is, okay. Olivia, we're going to go to you. You need to also unmute yourself. You guys have phone control, so does it look like Aldrin's now in your control? All right.
What about is Michelle? Oh, Michelle here.
Is Michelle? Okay, we're going to Michelle Nelson. All right, Michelle. This is like the raffle tickets where they're like calling.
Hello.
Nobody's there. Nobody wants our tote bag.
Can you guys hear me?
Are you there?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you. Go for it.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm actually sitting with Aldrin, and we came up with very short elevator pitches, just kind of if we ran into somebody in the elevator, how would we talk about public health in our work? I work mainly on a regional level, so mine is very broad. And Aldrin's is also kind of broad as well because he works with residents and businesses, kind of showing awareness about greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm just going to go ahead and read my very short elevator pitch. Public health and climate hazard mitigation planning go hand in hand. The main focus of hazard mitigation planning is to protect human life and property, which are contributing factors to public health. The resilience planners I work with at the Association of Bay Area Governments daily, with or without purpose, talk about public health and safety. Every disaster they plan for, every small detail, is with the sole purpose of mitigating and preventing any damage to human life and property. I have found that if you wish to protect and preserve the environment, you cannot do so without protecting and preserving public health. There is not one without the other. Being green can mean driving electric vehicles, riding bicycles, and or walking to work, but it can mean something else. Being green is to be healthy. Being green is a way of life. And that is my short elevator pitch.
Good.
Nice. Fantastic.
Well, I think it's nice that you talk about the regional level. So I think actually linking it with the planners they're thinking about health. So that's really important. I think being green can be a lot of things. So I think getting that message out is really key. One thing I would say is for the elevator pitch, it depends a little bit on who it is because they might not even know. Some people just don't even know about regional planning. So I think you might want to, depending on your audience, think about, is this somebody who's going to know about regional planning, or even kind of explain a little bit more about what that is. You guys are a special group. You have a lot of knowledge already. And so I think about the general public, it's good to think about that.
Yeah, my thing is that I really like how you were explicit about linking the mitigation and the adaptation together, because in some ways they're an artificial boundary that impedes solving the overall problems. So the idea that there's a linkage there is really important, especially for the planning community, because we do have a situation in California where the adaptation work is somewhat siloed from the mitigation work, and sometimes they actually are undoing what each other are trying to do. So the element, I think this is an important linkage to have made.
Thank you.
Do you want to mute all? We're getting some.
Sounds like Darth Vader.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you. That was really fun. I wish we had time to do more, and maybe you guys will pick up the opportunity in your own regions, or it'll come up in another member webinar. I think this activity obviously can be done over and over again as you refine things, and there's so many different ways to do it. I'll also mention one of the things that's really hard to do in a setting like this is to actually play act. But it takes practice, right? So a lot of you guys spent time kind of telling us what you were going to do instead of just jumping in and doing it. And I encourage you to actually go out and practice an elevator pitch, not by giving any preamble, by using it, working it, and then see what happens, because until you've actually done it with no context and actually just put it out there, it's hard to see what it's going to work, how it's going to work.
Just be careful if you're doing it on the way up or the way down, in case you need a quick exit.
So with that, I want to turn over to our first returning speaker, Dr. Neil Maislish, who's a research scientist with the California Department of Public Health. And he's going to be talking about climate change and health co-benefits. As those of you who were on the first training may recall, but I'll repeat for those who were not, Dr. Maislish focuses on the public health impacts of climate change in the built environment, modeling health co-benefits of active transport, and the developing community health indicators. He has over 25 years of experience in quantitative research methods in local and state government, academia, community clinics, unions, and the private sector. Despite increasing specialization of epidemiology, Dr. Maislish is an unabashed generalist. So, Dr. Maislish, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. After those kind of introductions, I always wonder who they're talking about. Anyway, thank you very much.
He's amazing.
Anyway, so what I'm going to do today is talk about health co-benefits and do as sort of a segue from that last presentation of the linkage between mitigation and adaptation. So what I want to do is just do a little bit of review from last time, because the couching and understanding of what produces health is really fundamental to get under your belt so that you'll see what the ultimate connections are. So why don't we go to the next slide. There we go. And this is, as you recall, there were two frameworks that I used. I didn't show the sort of the more traditional framework that you may be aware of in public health, where it's focused on individual behaviors, you know, smoking and the drinking and all the sort of the negative things that people do, without putting it into a broader societal context. And that's what this other framework called the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, BARHI. This is a collaboration of regional public health departments that have come up with this kind of way of conceptualizing what produces health. And while it's true that the health behavior part is in there, so you can see as you go sort of downstream and upstream what's producing health, you can look at the very far right side of this where, you know, it's sort of the end of people's lives where they're dying. But when you start going upstream, what's causing their illnesses, you begin to see where these individual risk factors, you know, the smoking, drinking, the gun violence, the alcohol, things like that. But then when you see, like, what is producing those things, it's not, you know, it's sort of like when we talk in planning about the last mile. Well, that last inch that's bringing the cigarette to your mouth is not just that last little piece. It's the community norms, it's the advertising, it's a whole milieu of other things that are going on, and those things are defined by the living conditions, the broader living conditions, families, within communities, within neighborhoods, within regions, within states, within countries, in the whole world. So those are the things that also are part of the production of health. And this just illustrates that there's many points of intervention along this continuum. If you take this even further back, you get into things like institutional power in the systems, whether the transportation systems, agricultural systems, political systems, economic systems that help define the choices that people have. You know, you've probably heard this, you know, the choices that people make are based on what choices they have. And if it's just not feasible because they can't afford, you know, healthy food and other things, and they're struggling with the, you know, sort of the daily things of life, spending hours getting to work in the morning, having kids when they come home, and these are the things that define people's lives, their stress levels and other things that become pathways for actual physiologic damage to their bodies. So this is, I want to, you know, review this because this is the way that we, you know, we in public health nowadays conceptualize how health is produced and how harm is produced as well. And we'll see in a few minutes where the climate change connections are as well. So on the next slide, this again is review, where in that previous diagram, you don't get a sense of weighting, how important these various factors are. But when we look at the scientific evidence for, you know, what, again, produces health, I mean, a lot of people think of health as sort of that step when you lose your health and you go to the doctor. But that's losing health. That's not having health. Health is all the things that happen before that. So based on, you know, sort of the best, you know, it's a combination of scientific studies and expert opinion, it's really the socioeconomic determinants of health that really are the biggest single factor. So that's education and housing and poverty reduction and income and things like that. Then the individual risk factors, that's probably the second, you know, most important factor. Clinical care, no question about it. Going to the doctor is important. And then preventive clinical services, those immunizations that right now in the state capitol we're having a lot of debate over, but those kind of preventive services, cancer screening, other things like that, you know, keep people healthy or detect illness at the earliest stages, those are things that the clinical is really good, and that preserves life over long periods of time. And then I have to say the built environment, which we all are really focused on, is important. But it's probably not as important as these other things. But they also depend on those other things as well. So it's, you know, when you look at the overall impact through multiplying effects, you know, it's a very important factor. So I just want to, again, there's a cumulative impact of all of these factors working together. So when you have any individuals, any family, any community, all these things are operating at the same time. So it's not just about the pollution that might be nearby. It could be the living in poverty and other factors that, or the gun violence or neighborhood violence that could be influence these things as well. So what I'm going to talk about next is this nexus between mitigation work, adaptation work, and its impact on health and the co-benefits. So this is really where a lot of things come together. So I don't know who said it first, but you know, the best defense is a good offense, in the sense that even though, you know, we may work in adaptation primarily or in mitigation primarily, you know, they are linked, and that the, you know, if we don't get our greenhouse gases under control, even the most energetic, robust adaptation strategy at some point will not succeed. It just will overwhelm us with too much sea level rise, too much heat, too much wildfires, too much everything else. It just will create such a physical, financial, and social burden. So I just want to point out that we need to have multiple strategies, and the sort of artificial wall between mitigation and adaptation is just that. It's artificial. We need to be working on multiple strategies all at the same time. Maybe in your work life, you'll only be working on parts of that, but just overall, I think we need to be promoting that more holistic approach. The other thing is that it's possible to achieve greenhouse reductions in adaptation, but it's also possible to do that in ways that either increase social equity, improve health outcomes, or not. So it's really about the vision and the policy that one comes to the table with. And depending on where you are in the organization, maybe in Civic Spark, you're starting your career, but you have the benefit of asking naive questions, and no one will, you know, penalize you for that. But you can, you know, think about, you know, where is equity in these discussions? Because even at the state level, I'm in a lot of meetings in the climate action team, and equity hardly ever comes up. Or if it comes up in a very narrow context of environmental justice, but it's a much broader issue than that. So optimizing health and other co-benefits, optimizing social health equity. And some people begin to actually coin a phrase called CHEAP. It actually stands for Climate Health Equity in All Policies. So it's a much more encompassing view of how to approach this from a policy standpoint. So again, we're all working on solving a big problem, but we can approach it in different ways and bring different motifs to that discussion. I think it's really important to stand up and speak out on those issues if you're not hearing them loud and clear. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the frameworks that have been developed to talk about how mitigation, adaptation, and health co-benefits all go together. So the international, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their fifth assessment. So this is what the world scientists have been working on. I think many people are aware of their work. It informs, it becomes the scientific basis for taking, knowing what the magnitude of the problem is and taking action. Well, in the human health chapter, they actually introduce a framework for where the intersection between mitigation, adaptation, and health co-benefits fits. So one approach that they mention is what they call incremental. I would call it more foundational. And it's really the recognition that economic development and socioeconomic development has this very salutary effect on improving human health. And of course, we can see this in impoverished countries more than perhaps in the United States, but it's true here too, that economic development, but kind of certain type, a sustainable type of economic development is the kind of thing that will, improve people's lives, especially low income and other disadvantaged groups. So that kind of background things, improving education, housing is going to be foundational to improving both, the resilience of a community. And I'll talk more in detail about what those mechanisms are. Really talk about transitional, and these are the kind of things that we're doing right now, especially around public health preparedness and other strategies, cooling centers that will deal with the specifics of the climate risks and increase resiliency and decrease population vulnerability. Lastly, talk about what they call transformational, and this is, if you remember the first public health presentation, I talked about, that pyramid of interventions where you get to, and the same thing with environmental management, that tier that basically eliminates your even thinking about it because it's been engineered out of existence. The risk has been engineered out of existence. We like that in public health as well. So this is really transformational where we've already employed engineering, whether it's structural engineering, it could be natural barriers, it could be natural engineering, it could be ecosystem services, it could be many things that are employed so that the climate risks are actually engineered out of our threat level. So that's the transformational approach. The idea is ultimately about reducing the climate risk and reducing social vulnerability. Often vulnerability is couched in terms of sort of the negatives. You don't have enough education, you don't have enough adequate housing or income, or you're linguistically isolated. But the resilience is the flip side of that coin, where it's asset-based, where you have many things that are positive. And a lot of times, we were talking about stigma earlier, where immigrant communities and other communities are stigmatized, but in fact, they bring with them many social assets. Those things have to be acknowledged and built on. Lastly, another framework that you see often is what I'm calling in the sustainability movement, but it's very much focused on localizing self-sufficiency and community efficacy. So this is another framework. I mean, it's not like one's good, one's bad. They all coexist together and they all feed into one another. But you see that, I actually borrowed They Localize as the logo on the top. They're a group that sort of symbolizes this very local approach. And I'll talk about some of the interventions. And I see some heads nodding that I know in Sacramento there's community gardens and other folks that are working on this kind of self-sufficiency. Sometimes it's tied to sort of local economic development strategies as well, which, anyway. Why don't we go to the next slide, and I'll start talking about some other frameworks. Obviously, this is a very busy slide. I'm going to pass around an example of this framework. Some frameworks are very general, and they're not like, they're more like strategies. But as you go sort of bridging from the broad strategies to the specific activities, it's helpful to have sort of an intermediate level framework. And this is something that Dr. Linda Rudolph, who's a real climate and health advocate, she's an Obama climate champion. This is something of the work that she's done at the Public Health Institute. But this is sort of getting more into the weeds of how you link the activities that you may be doing along the entire continuum of mitigation and adaptation with both an equity framework and a public health framework. There's also an environmental framework here, because basically what this framework is showing is that the systems that produce the health inequities are also the same ones that are creating some of the greenhouse gas emissions and burdens that we're experiencing from environmental degradation. So it's sort of an interesting way of coupling those two frameworks together to see how they're all linked. But as the diagram goes around the field, around the table, but also you can get a version of this from the URL. You can download this framework as well. Why don't we move on to the next one? And what I'm going to do now is sort of like a knockdown, drag out. I'm sort of going to, hopefully I won't be beating you up, but I'll be beating the topic up of making these connections between mitigation, adaptation, and health co-benefits. So in a sort of systematic way. And when I started doing this, I used some other materials that people published and used, but they actually I didn't see anything that combined the both together. So I thought maybe this might be something actually useful and somewhat new. Not that the information is new, but the coupling of the mitigation and adaptation co-benefits were at least brought together in these slides. So I'm going to do it sector by sector, starting with the transportation sector. And some of this stuff you probably are aware of because it's already been in your skits and other things. So I'll go kind of quickly through some of this stuff. So we know that active transport is an important strategy for reducing greenhouse gases. Some of the work that I've done showed that at very high levels, if we got the population going, basically at the Surgeon General's recommended level, about 20 minutes per person a day for an adult, we would be potentially reducing greenhouse gases, at least in the Bay Area, on the order of 10–15%. So it's not just like a cute strategy, it's actually a very potentially potent strategy, but it would require a reordering of priorities way beyond what we're doing right now. Anyway, so it reduces reliance on transportation fuels, which we know is a big part. It's about 37% of the whole greenhouse gas inventory in California. But from an adaptation standpoint, having physical activity, being healthier because of that, reduces your your individual medical vulnerability to the effects of climate change, whether it's asthma or other things, if you just have better health. So that is an important thing of just making you more resilient as a person. But also, on a community level, if you have a lot of people who are morbid, who have illnesses, that in any kind of heat wave or flooding event, you got to worry about their chain of meds going with them to the evacuation centers. It just increases the amount of energy that you have to spend on the whole effort to keep them safe during these episodes. You just have lower morbidity, you're going to have less of these kinds of things. One thing that we do need to pay attention to is most of the modeling work that's gone on around this issue raises the concern that with the increased mode share of bike and ped to our existing transportation networks, without a lot of additional investment in safety, could lead to higher injuries in bicyclists and pedestrians. So that's something that not just benefits, there are potential harms there, and we need to pay attention to those things as well. Public transport also has mitigation benefits because if you're shifting the mode from cars to buses, it's far more efficient. It's also, bus transportation is so much safer than car transportation. It's probably the safest mode. So you're going to be reducing injuries from road traffic injuries as well. The other thing is that if you have adequate transportation systems during an evacuation, you can actually get people out of the evacuation zone. And what we saw in Katrina and some of these other disasters, when public transportation wasn't well arranged, you had tragedy. So this is something that's really important as well. Other strategies of lowering speeds has the salutary effect of increasing fuel efficiency, as well as reducing the injury risk to pedestrians and bicyclists. But also, if you're out on the streets, the issues of social interaction, increasing social cohesion, stopping off at retail, which makes the business community happy as well. I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. And then I include this section in transportation as well, is a cool pavement. We talked about actually was mentioned about the black tops of the thing about cool roofs, cool pavements are about heat island reduction. They're not impervious, then we're talking about other benefits as well that I'll get to. I'm gonna have the next slide. Again, this is sort of knockdown drag out, but I think this just illustrates how broadly these benefits are. And as I go sector by sector, depending on where you are in your placement, you may have different hooks for appealing to different folks. Now I'm going to go into food and agriculture, and this is somewhat in the order of the magnitude of the health co-benefits that are available. So I'm going to talk about forestry management. Well, obviously, carbon sequestration is going to be really good. But if you do, I said biomass, I mean biogas generation, forest fall and other tree thinning, you could actually generate energy sources. It may also have the salutary effect of creating jobs along the way. In the health department, we've done some health impact assessments in Placer County and shown that this is really a possibility. So that's something really, really important. I'm going to move on to, well, the other thing is that because we've had policies of suppressing forest fires for the last century, we have such a huge buildup of fuel. The issue of devastating fires, like the rim fires and some things like that, pose not just local dangers, but the regional transport of those combustion projects over large areas, people who have respiratory health problems and cardiopulmonary problems. We know that there's a potential there. So there's, the forest, reducing forest fire risk has potential important impact on respiratory effect in broad swaths of California. Next one is actually about how we produce food and especially red meat. I think most of the Civic Spark participants have been through ecology courses and know about the trophic levels, and that as you go up the trophic levels, you become less and less energy efficient. Well, that's true with the food we eat too. So when we eat a lot of ruminants, folks, and that is just on-farm production of that is just not as energy efficient as a more plant-based diet. I'm not saying eliminate meat from your diet, but I am saying that the emphasis now is in such a direction that if we reduced our meat consumption, we would have great energy savings, but we'd also improve our health, because red meat consumption, there's been a number of epidemiologic studies that just illustrate that with increased red meat consumption, cardiovascular disease, as well as certain cancers, also increase. So there's a health benefit there too. I know it's very controversial. When I raise this to my colleagues at the Department of Food and Agriculture, they go ballistic, but the science supports this, so I have no problem saying this. Urban agriculture is another setting. When we look at the energetics of food production and see on-farm production versus food transport, actually it's the on-farm production where the most of the kilocalories as far as the energy is going. So it's a little bit unclear whether you can reduce greenhouse gases a whole lot by urban agriculture, but it has all these other benefits, especially in the adaptation range where you're creating community resiliency, especially for those expensive, high-quality, nutrient-dense foods that are in fruits and vegetables. That's the real thing that's important here. So we know that improving nutrition is part of improving people's health. The farm, this is farm management and farm cultural practices. This is agricultural practices. I'm talking about, water usage. We're in the middle of a drought now, fertilizer use, pesticide inputs. We know that, conservation tillage and many of the agricultural techniques that can be used to reduce energy use that will reduce greenhouse gases. But we also know that using less pesticides and improving, especially nitrates in drinking water is a big problem in California. A lot of it is from on-farm, percolation into the aquifers and things like that. These are things that could be improved if we had a different kind or different emphasis We also, the issue of growing crops for biofuels is a little bit controversial because many of the studies that have looked at this are not unequivocal about what the net benefit or net energy usage actually is. But there is also a concern, at least on a global level, that the shifting of crops to food crops, to biofuels, actually could increase food prices. So for the food insecure, which is a very substantial segment of California's low-income population, it's about 40% of California's low-income population are food insecure. So this could have a big impact on their health as well. Why don't I go through the slide, make sure I'm not overdoing my time. Am I showing? Okay. I'm going to go to the next big sector, which again, folks in Civic Spark are weighing into in a major way. We talked about weatherization this morning. So this is another area where there are health benefits and from both mitigation and adaptation strategies. So we talked about cool or green roofs, green buildings in and of themselves as far as vehicles for reducing energy use, conservation, and water use. So those are all positive things on mitigation. On the adaptation side, if they're designed in a way that cools the environment down, so during excessive heat days, people are already protected. That is a great advantage as well. So the heat-related illness, within people's homes, I mean, there is evidence that the slowly rising temperatures are going to have an impact on foodborne illness just by the slight rise in temperatures. So it's shifting the distribution of temperatures ever so slightly to higher temperatures. So that food that was out there that could have been within the safe limit, there'll be a higher percentage of times when that won't be true, just through higher temperatures. So you have these very subtle effects that could be occurring. We know the human nervous system is very sensitive to temperature, either too cold or too hot. And we talked about school performance this morning. I didn't mention it here, but it is part of the deal, that kids who are going to be exposed to excessively hot environments, just like they're adults working in factories or other settings that are too hot, are going to lose their productivity. And there was just a big study done by, called Risky Business, by a lot of thought leaders and business climate advocates who are predicting what the U.S. productivity loss is going to be just through higher temperatures. So this is one of those issues of, if we want to maintain our competitiveness and our productivity, we need to just make sure that, and obviously we work a lot inside, so all those things matter. Weatherization, we just talked about that. Energy costs, so this is you already did the poster this morning. In a sense, it was the one-page fact sheet. Energy-wise, health-wise. So this is just restating that in a different way. Again, anything that will increase family economic resources, especially in low-income people, is going to improve their health. The mortality income curves are very steep at the low-income end. So the biggest, per dollar spent in those low-income households, having an impact on their mortality is far greater than at the higher income level. That sort of marginal increases with increasing. So that cut point's roughly $25,000 or less. Above that, you don't see as big an impact. Because we're talking about pretty poor people. At any rate, so other things like minimum wage, are part of that. You might not think of those interventions as a health intervention, but in fact they have big health impacts. At any rate, okay, I think I've mentioned that. Urban design, we talked about tree planting this morning. Urban greening, I think you know all of those things. I'm just going to go on to the next slide. Talk about sort of the last slide on sort of the relationship between the health co-benefits and mitigation and adaptation strategies. So land use is a big deal. Compact growth, walkable, livable neighborhoods, reducing VMT, noise. We hadn't talked a lot about noise, but looks like noise has an independent effect on people's health, through cardiovascular health and things like that. So the epidemiologic record of that evidence is getting stronger and stronger as something that's independent from air pollution, because noise caused by vehicular traffic, say, is it the air pollution that those vehicles are causing, or is it the noise that those vehicles are? And it looks like they were both independently contributing to people's health. So you have this issue of car dependence, and for destination accessibility is well, that's one of the benefits. From an adaptation standpoint, the localization of the economy could be a very strong selling point for these kinds of activities. Whether it actually increases tax revenues or not, I don't think the whole story is there, but there are a lot of people who think that localizing the economy, strengthening the local economy is a very important part of an overall adaptation strategy. It's what they want to do anyway, but now you'll have a greenhouse gas or a climate angle to that. This is, you know, that more walkable, livable neighborhoods that have those kind of interconnections, increases physical activity, decreases pollution and noise. So those are some of the obvious benefits. But there is a sort of dark underbelly to this that's already happening in many places in California, and that's displacement. And there's actually an epidemiologic record already, not necessarily from the areas that are occurring in right now, but there have been health impact studies looking at what the effects of displacement from from gentrifying areas or areas that are rapidly changing in their community composition. Most of the time, the health effects are negative. So that's something that we need to pay attention to in a major way when we are promoting these. And there's also equity issues. Because even if we're swapping out suburban commuters for poor commuters, I mean, suburban commuters are still commuting, but if it's poor people versus higher income people, there's some equity issues in that. What the overall impact on greenhouse gas emissions by this displacement effect is a little unclear right now. But the equity issues are certainly clear. You go to places like eastern Contra Costa County, you see that the people who are being displaced from Oakland, from San Francisco, from the East Bay, are winding up in areas where a social service network is not well defined. Other places within Contra Costa County have those services, but not in the areas where the new displaced people are. And this whole issue of the suburbanization of poverty gets into these kinds of issues. So I'm harping on it because I think it's an important issue that we need to pay a lot of attention to. Now, other things, land use, natural barriers, they can potentially have a carbon sequestration impact, but it reduces, especially coastal storms and flooding. These kinds of strategies are really important. Of course, they're going to reduce injuries and reduce economic losses, because almost every natural disaster that's been looked at, when you look at the people who are displaced, they go for a long period, without unemployment. They take long times, if ever, to achieve the economic status that they had before. So when you look at the economic drivers of health, these things matter. So preventing those populations from being impacted are really important. Zoning, managed retreat, defensible spaces, things that are really about keeping people away from harm due to land use. That can have, if it's done ways, and I know in the Sacramento area, that kind of neat. I think there is a precedent in the Sacramento area where floodplain areas have been turned into parks. So this offers opportunities for recreation, green space, some of the positive mental health effects that were mentioned earlier.
In Colorado, they had the flood, and a lot of the reason they didn't have as much loss of life is because they had planned it earlier.
So these are kind of strategies that have benefits. Renewable energy, I think we know a lot about that, but to the extent that greenhouse gases and co-pollutants are reduced, then all the benefits around cardiovascular health and cardiopulmonary health are there. Another aspect of energy production is microgrids and other strategies that we've heard about, that during emergencies, heat emergencies, if the grid goes down, we saw this in a major way in Superstorm Sandy, during the cold season there, but people were literally huddling for weeks in apartment buildings that didn't have heat, and it puts big stress on families to be in those kinds of situations. But if you have microgrids, where the ability to maintain the grid, because the grid is under threat under climate change from an adaptation standpoint, and I think I mentioned it here, or I don't know if is that, maybe I didn't mention it before, but you know, our transmission lines are in forested areas. So part of the benefit of reducing fire risks, forest fire risks, is actually improving the ability of the transmission lines not to come down during those you know, big events, or just maintain their efficiency. So anyway, these are some of the things. We are so electricity dependent in the society that if we lose our electrical source, you know, our health facilities, you know, have backups, but you know, other things that we depend on for our daily lives, you know, run on electricity. So to the extent that we have these microgrids and other strategies to keep the electrical system stable during emergencies is super important. I'm going to talk lastly about economic development, because this is an example of where you could actually create jobs, but they are using a development strategy that could, in fact, increase greenhouse gas emissions. I'm separating these two strategies out. As we saw before, you know, the IPCC Fifth Assessment talked about how just general economic development improves people's health. Well, that's true here, too, in sort of a first world setting. Economic strategies that lift people out of poverty will improve their health, but it can be done in different ways. If it's done coupled to green jobs, then we're actually participating in the overall strategy that will reduce greenhouse gases and potentially reducing income inequality, because it's not just any old job. Where you look at the social grade, what we call the social gradient in public health, where the population is most suffering is really in the low-income groups. If we don't create enough low-income and middle-income jobs and have economic development there, we're not going to be increasing social equity, and we're not going to be increasing health equity. So we can do these development strategies and all the mitigation adaptation strategies, tone deaf to equity issues, or really paying attention to equity issues. If we pay attention to the equity issues, it'll be a super win-win for everyone, because then everyone in our society will benefit, everyone's health will benefit, and we'll just be able to, you know, weather the storms far better. So I just wanted to point out those kinds of things. And again, it gets back to that first slide. What is our vision? What are our, you know, policy objectives? And if we don't include equity into that mix, we are going to be missing one of the biggest opportunities in the 21st century. So with that said, I'll end here, and I don't know if there's questions or how you want to.
I'm sure there may be questions, but we're also a little bit behind.
Yeah, let's give other people
time.
a chance.
So why don't we transition right into Elizabeth's presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end if you can stay.
Yeah, absolutely.
If people could just speak in, if they have questions, raise their hand, so when we do have time for questions, we know who to call on, or type them into the question box, please. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Neil. That was excellent. And those slides will be available at another point on the resources page of the Civic Spark site. So at this point, I want to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Baca. This is a doctor-heavy day we have. And Dr. Elizabeth Baca is currently serving as the Senior Health Advisor in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. She is working across sectors to foster collaboration, elevate the connection between health and the built environment, and leading the effort to incorporate health considerations into the planning process. She is also engaged with several data initiatives to improve access to data to foster innovation in planning healthy, resilient communities. Previously, she served as the general pediatric faculty at Stanford Medical School and directed the community pediatric and child advocacy rotation. And we're very grateful to have her here today to speak about integrating public health into general plans. So thank you, Dr. Baca.
Great, thank you. And I was just going to take a few seconds for everyone to stand up just for a stretch break, because we are talking about health and we're sitting here for so long. So just stand up for 1 second. If you're watching remotely, you should stand as well. Just before we sit back down, one of my thoughts from the presentations earlier, as we were talking about, you guys were talking about your pitches, I would say it'd be a great idea to get on some listservs for businesses doing green work. So GreenBiz has a great listserv, and I think they just have a lot in terms of messaging, in terms of how they tailor to different communities and different audiences, and they can be a really great resource. So on that, you can go ahead and sit back down. The only other thing I was going to add to Neil's excellent review of all the co-benefits for weatherization is there's some really interesting work, particularly around asthma, since you guys had a pitch on asthma on, so one, LEED certification, which is for energy efficiency, but it doesn't have to be LEED certified, but there are a lot of weatherization programs that look at the health benefits directly from decreased asthma exacerbations from doing that. So it is great to be here with you all today, and I get to hear about your fantastic work through Holly since we're in OPR together, but it's always really exciting since I spent a lot of time teaching. I always get really happy to come back and spend time with all of you guys because you're inspirational. So today, I'm not doing another, can I actually do my own switch? Would that be okay? So for our slides, we actually have a bunch of learning objectives, and unfortunately there's a little bit of delay off of here. So a couple of things. I know that you guys have had a couple of trainings already, but I wanted to show, I think sometimes images can show a lot, so I wanted to share just some general health status issues. It would be great if after you leave today you have your kind of concept of how you would define health, so we'll talk a little bit about that, and I think you'll probably have a good definition since you've been working with Neil. The other thing is to describe some of the factors that have really helped us move planning forward in California and nationally. And I think the thing about healthy planning is that a lot of them really, not necessarily, but if you're thinking about it from a healthcare perspective, they can be good for climate and they can be good for health. The other piece is we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific elements within the general plan, and then I'll talk about what we decided to include in the general plan guideline updates. We have 4 key themes: health, economics, equity, and climate change. The last, it seems like there are a lot of, there's not a quiz at the end, I promise. We'll also talk about how to identify healthy, resilient community principles and how you can start to integrate that locally. And then the last is some opportunities where you as Civic Spark can actually get involved in this now. So health status. So I think one of the things, and it's really fascinating since I spend a lot of time in private sector and I spend a lot of time with public health and then with county departments, people have very different definitions of how we're doing health-wise. So some people think our life expectancy is going to be great. I was just at an event recently where we're going to be living over 100 years and everyone's going to be super healthy and cancer is going to be gone, that are in the innovation entrepreneur space. And then some people are like very concerned about how unhealthy people are. So I think that this is just a really interesting graph that I haven't used in a long time. This shows adult obesity, and this is going through time. So no data means there's not a color. Less than 10% is the lighter blue. You can see the percentages shifting. You see other colors being added in. So it gets up to greater than 20% around 2000. Then it gets up to greater than 25%, right? And you start to see, it's continuing to show that it's worsening. So then you start to see that greater than 30% in certain cases. And some places where, this is 2006. I did not update these slides because I used to use them a long time ago. But I think what's really interesting is you just see that there has been a transition in health, right? So we think about obesity, and we know that obesity can predispose to a lot of other chronic disease that I'm sure you guys talked about last time. But I think it's just really important because, again, when you hear these conversations, people might say, oh, we're totally healthy, everything's fine. Certain populations are really healthy and certain aren't. And so I think that the obesity is just one area that a lot of people have been looking to. This is a great website. It's stateofobesity.org. So it's on the slide. Just because of time, I won't click through the internet to show you. But you can actually go by state. You can see California and how it's gone up and down. There's been some differentiation of measurement, so it's not completely comparable throughout the years, but I think it's just a good snapshot of issues across the U.S. This is another graph that gives an international perspective of how the U.S. is doing. So this is from a great report called U.S. Health and International Perspectives, Shorter Lives, Poorer Health. It's talking about the U.S. And a lot of it, so this is childhood obesity prevalence in 2011. And so it looked at kids who were age 5 to 7, and this is percentage. So you can see that countries like Switzerland had about 13% to 16% of their children had obesity. And if you look at the U.S., you can see it's about 35%. Now, this is like everyone globally together. Again, I think you've heard a lot that different populations have more of a burden than other populations. But this study, when they did this, they looked at a whole host of chronic diseases and other factors, and even the researchers themselves were surprised at some of the findings. They weren't expecting it. And as Dr. Maislich mentioned, there's the gradient of health. So it can be that people, you often think about if it's just low income or high income, but it actually is across the gradient. So even in the higher income groups, we did worse compared to other countries, which was shocking to the researchers, but really important to be thinking about. Again, is sometimes you can be part of discussions and it's like, well, we're the U.S., we have the best health. I didn't show you some other slides because everyone always has a really sad face after. I wanted to keep you guys like ready and motivated to do work, but it is really important. So I think on that note, one of the things that's really fun, so my background was I did policy first, but then I spent time in pediatrics, and I spent a number of years. And so, I think that a lot of times when you think about health and you're talking about housing or you're talking about transportation, it seems so far away. You're like, how does this have anything to do with housing? And you recognize when you're in clinical practice, everything. So a lot of the kids that I saw when I went into pediatrics, I thought they were going to be pretty healthy and that I'd have a lot of opportunity to do prevention. And instead what you see is a lot of kids are really unhealthy. And it's not even by choice. It's just that a lot of their environment creates a situation where they're pretty unhealthy. And so day to day, I would be talking to kids, and this is very, I was in East Palo Alto, and so this is what a lot of East Palo Alto, some places, it's getting better. I worked with the city planner, so there's even really amazing stuff going on right now. But it's very car-centric, and so we would say, okay, you're coming in, let's try to be active, and then they're like, well, I have no place to go, it's not safe. Or I had a bike and my bike was stolen. Or my parents work 2 jobs, and so I can't go to the after-school program, right? So those were really discussions that happened all the time, particularly as Neil was mentioning, when you think about resources from decreasing exposures, if you have more in your budget, that helps because you make different health decisions. So when we look at this, we see that this is kind of what we would think about as a healthy place. This is a farmer's market in San Francisco. You've got bike storage and people walking around and access to healthy foods, but it's like, how do you get from this environment, which is a lot of places, to this environment that's a much healthier place? And a lot of those policies can be established in general plans. So, oops. Oh, do you need to use this?
Yeah, we're a little frozen in some of the other regions.
Oh.
It's actually not even, I think if we exit out of the PowerPoint and then restart it,
okay.
It might.
Okay. 1 second, folks, sorry about that.
See, we already had set up the expectation that we would have one IT snafu, so we're like rolling and we're ready. I'll wait until we get them back up.
We need a mitigation plan next time.
Go ahead and. We're good?
Does it work?
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Okay, now we're.
Go back to just main screen instead of the PowerPoint.
Well,
go up one more.
What I can do is just talk from my PowerPoint slides, and then we'll flip to the.
No, Jenny, go to.
1 second. If everyone talks with me, it's really stressful. So just give it a second.
There you go.
What are people seeing now? Right now, nothing, but it's on a little bit of a delay, so just give it a second. People seeing it? No, they're seeing just PowerPoint. No. When you let me do that. Okay. No.
just leave it like that for a minute.
There we go.
Yeah.
That working? Yeah.
Should be.
Okay. Now that I can keep track, you guys can catch up with slides. Let's see if that works. Yay, okay. So I usually would ask you guys to do the definitions, but just since we don't have enough time, I think, you know, when I used to teach, I would say, what does health really mean, right? Because again, just as Dr. Regis was saying, we usually think about health and it's like the absence of disease, right? And so it's always really fun when you're doing like a bigger audience and you go in and like everyone's got this frightened look like, please don't ask me. But always that's when you get the best responses because they're really spontaneous. And so I've had things like well-being or groundedness or total sense of, like, I mean, I've gotten so many crazy but great answers. And, you know, when we think about health from the social perspective, it's really around the World Health Organization, which is a complete state of physical, mental, which I think is really important as we think about some of the issues around vulnerability, and social well-being. So it's really all of those things. So it's not just the absence of disease. The other piece is that I think as we, is it going? Yeah, okay. As we think about this, you know, then you hear this thing, well, what about all, like, we should just do better healthcare. Why is it that, why are people not as healthy? And I think, again, it just really overlaps with how there's so much that's going on outside of clinic. It's not that there aren't amazing providers, but it's really important to think of the broader context. And when we think about just as the bar-high framework is very similar to this, but the problem is that we usually conceptualize health really all the way down here, but it's all of these other factors like we've been talking about. And this is really where it's great because with you guys having the opportunity to have some of these conversations with groups that aren't usually thinking about health in this way, you actually can start to bridge and raise awareness on some of that gap. I think one of the other pieces that comes into play was as you're thinking about, okay, so if we're not going to be able to solve all of the health within the clinic, and we're going to need to think about housing and the environment and trees, where trees are placed, and funding, you look at the different programs that are involved in that, and they're kind of all going different ways. They have a touch point, but they're not necessarily aligned. So you say, well, how are we going to ever get positive change when they're all kind of going different directions? And what we're saying is that with this growing recognition, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but we're starting to see a lot of sectors and policy and regulation, even funding sources start to align so that we can have more of an impact in health. And that's exciting for many reasons. And this is where I think you guys can have a big role. At least that's what I keep telling Holly. Civic spark coming here. I know I get so cheesy sometimes, it makes me blush. But, you know, I think one of the reasons, you know, so people say, okay, great. So, you know, the Iwani principles, the work that LGC has been doing, has been thinking about this for decades, right? This isn't a new concept. Thinking about how when you're planning, you're thinking about health. There's definitely a new interest. And so just to give you a little bit of background, in case this comes up in your conversations, I think there are really 4 big areas that have been coming together to help really promote healthy planning, and that also provides a lot of great resources for you guys. So I think there's some policy opportunities that have come up nationally, but particularly in California. There are a lot of economic drivers with changes in healthcare, innovation in planning, design, and then funding. So from a policy perspective, there's been a lot of conversation about the Affordable Care Act, but not necessarily, excuse me. I think it'll be fine. So there's been a lot of conversation about the Affordable Care Act, but not as much about some of the other side, which goes along with healthy planning. So when the Affordable Care Act happened, one of the things is public health has been doing this work for a really long time, clearly. But what happened with the funding incentives is it used to be that if you got sick, you went in and you got reimbursed for most systems. What changed with the Affordable Care Act is it actually created more of a system where they want you to keep populations healthy. So it's a very different mechanism of thinking about health. And so hospitals have increasingly started to think about population at a different level and get involved in healthy planning as well. And what that's done is it's really moved this conversation forward in a major way over the last couple of years. California specific, so I know you guys have been getting training on some of the legislation here in California, but again, as we're thinking about things that help make a healthy community, complete streets is really key. Having the legislation in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and doing the sustainable community strategies. There's a lot of really amazing work going on with the SES process right now that you should definitely, I would say, again, getting on listservs to start reading about that. And what we're doing in the Office of Planning and Research and with the Strategic Growth Council with some of the new funding programs, and again, starting to integrate co-benefits and thinking about health and climate economics all together really matters. As far as specific initiatives in California, the governor issued an executive order and brought together a really dynamic team to think about health. And they wanted to get better costs, they wanted to improve health outcomes, and they wanted to really think about, you know, living well. It's not just about disease and managing disease, but how do you start to promote wellness and health? And so it's kind of hard to see because it's so far away, but healthy communities was actually one of their priorities, which again it's a different perspective that's starting to get out there. The Health and All Policies Work Group works at the state level. It's a great group with people from Caltrans, with people from the Department of Education, really multi-agency coming together to think about health. The Department of Health actually put together a wellness plan, which actually builds off of the Let's Get Healthy California Task Force and goes into some more detail, uses many of the indicators that Dr. Maislich has actually developed, and then local government innovators. So from an economic perspective, this is a graph borrowed from the Urban Land Institute. So Urban Land Institute tends to be a lot of developers and to represent primarily developers, but it's very interesting because from their perspective, they're starting to think about health as well and thinking about these issues. So this just shows the percent of GDP in the US and how much we're spending on health and how much is projected. And so you can see it's been going up. So again, despite having worse health outcomes in many places, we're seeing more expenditure in health and not getting better results. And so if you look, they have this study actually does a really great job looking at other countries, and you can see kind of what you're getting on your return on investment. I see some disgusted looks in the back. And I think that's really important, again, to mention that, again, it's not the same. So when I worked with the residents, we would actually graph out the numbers every month. We would get new residents that would come through, and we'd have them play with data and look at some of the health outcomes and look across different economic groups and look across different racial groups. And so this, again, just shows that you know, low-income families are disproportionately affected, and we also see racial issues that are disproportionately affected as well. So as far as some of the other policy factors that I think have been really important to help move planning forward and why there's been so much momentum, a lot of the national professional organizations have actually started to embrace this within their organization, which is really important because I think there's one thing to be within the health community saying this is important, but then it ends up being like almost an imposition unless it's getting woven in through their work streams. And so it's great because they've been able to take this up as their own priority and their own initiative and start to move it forward. So the American Planning Association has done some really great work. So that's primarily represents planners, but some developers can also be part of the organization, planning commissioners as well. The American Institute of Architects and the Clinton Global Initiative have also embraced healthy planning and thinking about healthy communities. And the U.S. Green Building Council here, I'm actually missing that meeting today, it's happening right now, but it's basically they do the LEED certifications, and they've brought together businesses, so Google, Genentech, Facebook, all of these big businesses who are thinking about how their practices affect health are starting to come together, which is exciting. And then the Urban Land Institute, which I mentioned, these are just pictures from some of their reports. The Urban Land Institute also just came out with a new toolkit, which is an amazing resource for you guys to look at. From a funding perspective, I think this is also really key because it's one thing to say this really matters. It's another thing to say, then how do we start to implement this and move it forward? One of the big things that we mentioned with one of the earlier presentations is how important it is to partner. And so collaboration for this work is really key. And so some of the funding streams have actually been able to help bring people together because you have to have time together to learn. So the Center for Disease Control actually provided a fair amount of funding for that. So community transformation grants to help bring people together on the ground. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation just recommitted $500 million which is a lot. But it's basically, and they've really, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the graphs that I sent, that I gave you the link to for the other maps are actually in partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They've been really focused particularly on childhood obesity. The San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, sometimes I'm so immersed in this I forget and it doesn't even make sense. I was talking to one of our fellows and he's like, wait a minute, the Federal Reserve Bank cares about health? And the answer is yes, because they've invested so much money in community development and recognize that it's not always working, and a very important part to really make it effective when you're thinking about the economic side is also thinking about the health side. And so they've got a whole initiative, again, with a ton of resources to bring people together to be thinking about healthy communities, primarily from the healthcare sector. And then the California Endowment, I currently changed the slide on accident. So to transition over to the general plan update, I can't see a raise of hands for those of you on the phone, but in here, how many of you have looked at your general plan? Just raise your hand. A little bit. Okay, this is perfect. This is great. This is great for pre-post test because like next week everyone's going to raise their hand. I'm going to feel really good about this discussion. So the general plan, it seems really kind of esoteric and not as helpful. And let me say, it's one tool, right? So it really matters on the political sport as we were talking about earlier, but it can be a really useful tool. So general plans, basically, this is kind of like a crash course, general plan 101. Every county and city needs to adopt a comprehensive long-term plan for their physical development. In other places, so these exist in other cities, and other states have them, but they're not the same throughout. So they vary by location. In other places, they're called comprehensive plans. So if you're trying to search or Google or learn more about it, we'll quickly realize that general plan is specific to California, and other places call it a comprehensive plan. The last time our guidelines, and this is important, the last time our guidelines were updated they were updated in 2003. So with this update, we've incorporated a lot of new legislation and a lot new state planning priorities. But basically, this is one of your learning objectives. You guys can take notes. Basically, I'm just kidding. You don't have to take notes. But I see a lot of you taking notes. That's great. There are 7 required elements. So again, this seems kind of like esoteric. You're thinking like, oh, there's land use, there's circulation, there's housing, conservation, open space, noise, and safety. However, when we start to think about a lot of the stuff that Dr. Maislich was just talking about, it ends up really aligning with these, right? So you've been talking about climate action plans, but also these things are already addressed in pre-existing required documents across California. So safety, for instance, is one of the big things where you're already thinking about fire hazard and you're thinking about fault lines. So it's really important to just realize that this is another tool that local jurisdictions have, and they're all required to do this. One thing that's really key is there's an asterisk down here. So in San Joaquin, if any of you are working in the San Joaquin area, air quality also has to be addressed. People always ask me, why is it just San Joaquin? I was not there for that legislation. I don't know. Many places also will address air quality in their general plan.
I can tell you if you like.
You can?
I wasn't there for that legislation. Oh. I'm not that old, but they're out of compliance with the Clean Air Act because their air is so bad, I believe.
Well, yes, but why didn't it apply to everybody?
Because they were bad enough that it happened there.
Okay. In any case, one other piece on general plans is you have all the different elements. They don't have to, you don't have to have a specific land use element and then circulation. You can combine them, so it's fine. You can do any kind of combination. Important things about the general plan is that there should be consistency. So you can't say one thing in your land use element and then say another thing in your open space element. Like, they need to make sure that they align. You also have the option to add in additional elements. And so this is one where a lot of places have added in, as I mentioned, air quality locally. Or they've added in economic development is a big priority. Many places have started to, especially the community sites that the California Endowment is funding, have done some work on having health elements, which we'll talk about a little bit. And you know, so it's great that you can add in those different elements. Even if you add in an optional element, that still needs to be consistent. The other thing that's really important is all the data analysis and goals and policies have to align. So you know, it's just really important as you're thinking about what you're going to use to make sure that everything is consistent. The update process can take years. So I think it's one thing, this is another area where it's really challenging, especially from the community organization perspective. If you're trying to get people excited about something, it's a big balance between expectations of what it can do and how long it's going to take. And then, you know, this work, when we think about, there's a great colleague of mine talks about the built environment, and if you look at like things like a lot of places where people live, you have to get in your car to go everywhere. Those decisions were made, you know, 15, 20 years ago, and so it's come to this point today. It just takes a long time, or a much longer time, to see change throughout. But it's really important. And there are many steps along the way to do an update, so that's good, and that can also be challenging, but I think the opportunity there is it also allows for a lot of insertion points for community to have input into the process. So as far as public health and general plans, this was a great study that was done by the American Planning Association. So again, they have a whole research arm, and they've been doing research looking at this, which is really helpful because they have a national perspective. And so I think one of the things that we've really learned is you can learn so much from other places. And I mean, I think probably with all of your projects with CivicSpark, you probably get to share what's working, what's not working, what are the challenges. And this study was done in 2011, and what they did was they sent out a survey, and they said, okay, for all of you who are addressing public health, you know, are you addressing it, and what issues are you addressing? And so this is from 2011. I already know in California we have other places that have adopted more health policies, but I think it's just a good example. Again, California is often leading the way in some of this work, and so that's pretty clear here. This slide is a little bit, there's a ton of information, but I think it's a really important one. This is also directly from their report, just to give you a sense of some of the issues that are being addressed in general plans. And this is, again, from a national perspective. But we can see that environmental health and emergency preparedness, active transportation, which we've talked about a lot, can have tons of benefits from a perspective of climate adaptation, mitigation. And so this just goes across to show you the different types of health issues that were addressed back then. So this is for our general plan guidelines. So when we started to do the update of the general plans, again, we recognize that there's been a lot of change in the last, I guess, now 10, 12 years. And so it was a real opportunity to think about what would we want to integrate into the guidelines that are used. Now, again, it's guidance, but a lot of local jurisdictions, and I was just on the phone yesterday talking about this with some of the planning consultants, can think that this is a really great resource. So when we started to do the update, recognizing that, again, these are the statutory requirements, we wanted to weave 4 key issues throughout. And not just because they're also interrelated, especially, I mean, economic development, that's really key for all of this work. So we really focused on climate change, health, economics, and equity. A couple of things that we recognized were going to be a challenge. So even in your local area, which I hope you all go and read your general plan, it might be that it's not been updated, as we were talking about, for 15 years. It might be that it's getting ready to go through an update, which would be really exciting because it might be a place that you can have some input. But it varies throughout. The only thing that gets updated on a regular basis is the housing element. And so we knew that timing would be a challenge, but we thought that at least bringing this context in to start integrating some of these policy priorities was key. So in our new guidelines, which are going to be coming out hopefully soon, we'll be releasing the draft for public review after it goes through agency and department review. There are some new things, you know, from the 2003 guidelines. One is that we have a new chapter on community engagement. So again, as you're thinking about this work, just going back to some of the previous comments, listening to the community is something that we've discovered is very important. And it can also help establish a community vision. So, you know, different communities are going to have different priorities. It could be climate, it could be health, it could be economics, and really helping to have them be part of that process to inform it from the beginning is key. We also, from a community perspective, with the engagement process, we already talked about some of your flyers, but trying to do it in making sure it's in the local language, and having more meetings than not. There's very little statutory requirement on the community engagement piece for how you should do that outreach, but local jurisdictions that have funding and have the priority, especially in partnership with community groups and sometimes the departments of public health locally have been able to be involved, can really help move that forward.
If I can add, I think
Sure.
they've learned, especially as they take on topics like climate change that are contentious, that if they don't invest in some community engagement up front, they're going to get more pushback, and it can really blow up in their face and cause a bigger delay and cost overrun. So there's a...
Definitely, yeah, no, I mean, that's huge. I mean, the thing about getting input early on and often is been a big lesson that we've heard from feedback. So we have an expanded chapter on social equity, environmental justice, and community resilience. And I think it just, you know, it's really interesting with this. When you look back at the planning literature, so it was back in the 60s, there was actually something called social equity planning. And it was really going alongside with the civil rights movement. And it didn't really take off. It didn't really get to a place where it became something it's not really done as much today. Fascinating if you look, there's a lot more that's happening on social equity, but it tends to be very separate from, there's a lot of confusion around environmental justice and social equity, and some of the groups even have differences of opinion. But social equity planning actually was happening in the 60s and then sort of kind of tapered off. And then the environmental justice movement in the 80s really started to pick up, and then especially with the executive order in 1994 really started to move that forward. And so what we're doing is we're kind of broadening that perspective, saying that social equity is a really key piece to think about from the very beginning. Again, it's all voluntary, but for local jurisdictions as they're doing their plans to really be thinking about, as Neil mentioned, these implications. And I think just a key point is that community resilience is actually in this chapter, at least right now in the draft, but as Neil was mentioning, you know, we think about vulnerability, but the flip side of that is resilience. And so if you're thinking about social equity pieces as you're doing your planning, you can actually, and what we do is have some examples of policies that really help highlight how when you're thinking about resilience and communities, that's better for everybody as a whole. We have a new chapter on climate change, and it's woven throughout. So some places have started to integrate their climate action planning process with their general plan process. And again, I think it's great because it ends up, the more you can align things, the more kind of with the arrows it helps move it forward. We have the chapter on healthy communities and links to model policies as well as recommended data. So from the climate approach, Michael McCormick says hi. He's from OPR, and he helped start this program with LGC. So I'll be like, we'll give him a good thumbs up back to him. But I talked to him because I said I was going to be spending some time with you, and he's excited that you guys are doing this work. But he wanted me to highlight a couple things, particularly with the climate approach. So one is that climate change, to think about it really is a force multiplier. So it's not something new, right? I mean, in some ways it is, but in the sense that a lot of the issues that you're having to think about existed, you were addressing, but now it's just everything's going to be much more significant. And so things like drought and flood and fire, and again, these have all been typically addressed in general plans. So that's, again, an opportunity. It's interrelated. So again, I think just as Neil was mentioning, we think about like adaptation over here, and then mitigation over here, and then land use over here, and then all of these things are very separate. And so the opportunity is to really think about having a place where they can all come together. And so land use is one of those really key pieces. Where you're placing businesses, where you're placing homes, really determines like how the community is growing, really has these long-term impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. One of the challenges with doing the climate action plan is it's a much longer forecasted outlook to think about integrating these plans. And so that's one of the challenges, because the general plan guidelines really think a little bit shorter term, 20 to 30 years. But it is important to that you can still address that and you can incorporate that. And there are lots of resources to use this effectively. So whether, and we can give those to you, I think just for the time, I probably have to wrap this up pretty soon. Just for time, I didn't put them in here, but once, as you start reading, definitely feel free to reach out to us, to talk with Holly. We can provide you things that are tailored to what you need for your local work. So additional considerations, again, partnerships and collaboration, it's very important. Robust community engagement, as we talked about. Some of this work, bringing health and equity in from the very beginning of the plan process is key, because that way decisions aren't made. So as the process starts to get updated, and I think this is a lesson for the sustainable community strategies as well that's going on, that might be happening, or any of the planning processes. Zoning ordinances being updated, all of those things, I think they're fairly similar lessons learned for this. And then data and mapping. So as far as with the health themes that came out, so we did outreach across the state of California. We worked with a lot of nonprofit organizations. We worked with the Department of Public Health across the state. We worked with the State Department. We really got a lot of input and feedback on the different pieces that would be considered. And you can see that there's a whole host of different themes that emerged. Active living and recreation is a big one. Our climate and resiliency, because there's so much overlap with all of this. So what I thought I would do is just provide you a couple of examples that come from the chapter on how it's framed to address health. So for instance, active living and recreation, one of the things that local areas have started to do, particularly around health and also with vulnerability indices and climate, is looking at data. So I think that's a really big one, and the geospatial data can be really powerful. We've worked with some places that when they were having community meetings, just having that map, almost like the obesity map in the beginning, to see the change, people are like, wow, that's totally different from saying it's like a 20% increase or something. But basically, there are different types of data that you can look at. Again, this can be a little challenging because it's not always at the same level to make decisions, but at least as a starting point. And more places are starting to use more data rather than less to inform their policy decisions. When you're thinking about some of the health data that you can use, there's also the opportunity to think about some of the built environment data, so overlapping that. And I would say one of my favorite examples of that work was done in Los Angeles. Again, we can send you these resources if you're interested in seeing them. But then some potential policies. So if, as a community, you're saying we really want to prioritize active transportation and forms of active transportation, some of the things would include, we're going to say that we want to have parks and recreation programs. And we're going to make sure that when we're building trailways, that we're going to make sure it links to places. So it's going to link to jobs, it's going to link to amenities, pursuing urban greening programs, as we talked about all the health benefits from a climate perspective, and then active design. So a great example of this was Sacramento County actually updated their housing element, and within their housing element, they said, we're going to prioritize active design. They then did active design guidelines, which helps from a policy perspective to really implement the work, and they've done some really great programs in that. But it just shows you how having that from the high level, again, going back to the vision, to the policy, and then helping get it done on the implementation side. Let's see. So from a climate and resiliency perspective as well, from health, you could start to think about, well, okay, maybe we're in an area that has a lot of extreme heat. So do we have data on morbidity from extreme heat or asthma exacerbations due to air quality? And so local jurisdictions have started to look at this. And then you can think about, tree canopy and air pollution, and then prioritizing certain potential policy options. So a lot of this really links directly to the policy implementation side of the previous health benefits and consequences. But for instance, you could think about energy conservation, integrating plans to make sure you're explicitly addressing public health, and strategies for cool communities, for instance. This one is just on safety and connection. So again, it's really fascinating. Until you look at the data, you don't actually know where the highest injuries are. Did you work with San Francisco on their study? Or you didn't? Okay.
I mean, I know Megan, but
you didn't do it. Okay. But there's great examples of, like, some areas have a much higher percentage of crashes, so you can actually focus your attention to those areas and do designs and upgrades. Other things, like whether neighbors are willing to help each other, or thinking about Can you trust your neighbor? Those kinds of indicators are really important for social connection and safety. And then some potential policy things you could think about within this are joint use agreements with schools or with community organizations. Also, there's a lot around crime prevention through environmental design, and LGC's been, I think you guys have it coming out soon, the document that's a policy, the guidebook on crime prevention through environmental design. So again, these are things that you can actually can institute within the policy space. And then separate pedestrian, bicycle, and auto lanes. So Civic Spark, this is where you guys come in. I think that one of the big things is that there's definitely growing, like I said, there's a ton of momentum that people are really starting to recognize these links. But all of this work that you're doing, whether it be through the flyers, whether it be through the schools, with your community partners, you have a great opportunity to start those conversations. It could be an elevator pitch that you can carry on for a while. The other thing is that if local areas, depends. I know you guys are working on a ton of different projects, but it's a great place that you can actually help facilitate, kind of be the glue for some of these processes to help carry messages back and forth and to really always make sure that the community voice is included in the conversation and part of the process, I think is really key. One thing is that it might be that you help assemble best practices and model policies. So we're going to have a lot of those links within our guidelines, but there are tons of other examples across California that have really done some great work. And so, if an opportunity comes up in your local jurisdiction, you're working on a project and they're like, we're kind of thinking about this, you guys can actually help put together your own presentations and share this work with them, which is pretty cool. And again, you're young, so you can put all of this stuff in and you don't have to think about some of the other issues. The educational series, so we're going to be doing a series that's going to dive into more depth on each of these different topics over the next year, and so we'll make sure that you get the invite, but it would be great to have you listen in on those webinars. And then most importantly, I would say keep us posted, because you are really, the eyes and the ears on the ground, and especially, at the state level, I think it's so important to be connected with what's happening at the local level. And so if you're hearing things, it's really helpful for us, whether it be a need for different resources or specific technical assistance or just how policies are being received or not received, messaging that's working, not working. So we definitely welcome that as well. And Holly's with you guys a lot, so I know she'll keep us posted. The last thing I wanted to do, I think I have enough, like 2 more minutes? Sure. Okay. I'm trying to speak really quickly, is that these are some great images for one of our consultants that works with us. And I think, even this can be really powerful as to how you're telling the message, because you can actually show with an image of what exists today versus with the vision of what could exist, depending on what policies you decide to implement. And so, when you look at this, this is actually not that bad. It's actually fairly walkable. You could think if you're in like a wheelchair or you're, you have some kind of mobility issue, it might get a little bit harder to get around, especially if the foliage started to overgrow. But based on policies of things around more complete streets, walkability, you could actually see that that would change. Another thing, if you're thinking about elderly populations having places to rest along the way, having seating, and if some of the work we've talked about, having places be more walkable. So, it's not that you're having to get in your car and drive somewhere, but maybe some of the amenities or housing is located right there. And as you start to build that out, you get the ability to have more people. And then again, from a crime prevention through environmental design perspective, if you have more eyes on the street, you start to have people interacting from a social connection perspective. That can be really important. And then the bike lane. If you have your own bike lane, again, that makes it a lot safer. People are much more apt to use it. I personally don't bike. I do all this bike policy, but I'm too scared to get hit. And so when we have more of these bike lanes, that'll be great. But that's just an example. And then this is actually an example of an area. This is more of a Sunday street, but other places where you can do design so that it's joint use, so you can actually use the space in different ways. This is an example of a farmer's market that could come in.
Who would want to hang out in that last picture?
I know,
the first
right?
picture? Yeah.
I would totally be there.
Yeah.
So this is a picture from Florida, but and these are all from Urban Advantage. It's amazing if you ever need things like that. You can actually purchase images online. They sell them, but this is, you know, and again, if you're trying to think about walking, it's a pretty big intersection. A lot of places like that. I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, so everything is like 5 lanes, and it's really hard to get across. But you could, again, thinking about maybe putting in some crosswalks so that it's a little bit easier to see. And this is adding in a bus system, right? So instead of having that lane of traffic, you're actually creating a public transit option, which is really key. And the greening, I think the urban greening piece is really important. This just shows kind of denser development coming in. And again, the more folks you have on the street, again, it's really important because you start to think about safety. So on that, I will wrap it up and say thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have people coming in here at 12:30, right?
Yeah.
We have a couple minutes for questions. So I'm sure there's been some questions that have gone back a ways. We're trying to catch up with them. In the meantime, anybody in the room have a question for our speakers based on the presentation?
Not a question, but I'd just like to thank you, Dr. Nazlak and Dr. Baca, for sharing your expertise with us. You all are getting used to great talent coming in, but these are two of our state and really national leaders on these topics. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise.
And I think I'll comment while we make questions from my perspective. I mean, what you guys are talking about, this convergence, those arrows kind of aligning, was a particularly telling slide to me, because this is a sea change in how government is viewing itself. And California, I believe, is at the forefront, and particularly this administration, of trying to shepherd that forward. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy or it's going to be fast, but the fact that there are people in the administration really working on that level of integration, trying to grapple with these questions. This general plan guideline is such a, it is inconceivable that it could have been done this way a decade ago. And so that's really, for you guys who are listening and in the room, you're in a new world order for local government operations, for state government operations, and it's out of need, but it's an opportunity, and it's exciting, I think, for people who've been in it a long time to see this happen, and for you guys to build your careers here.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing to add to that is that it is really hard and it takes a long time. So, you know, we'll do talks, people are like, but how do you do that? I'm like, it's not for the faint of heart. So it's challenging, but it's also really rewarding because, again, it's going to take a long time. And what we're doing today, what you're doing today, is going to make a difference in 10, 15, 20 years. The other thing I would say is that, you know, one of the biggest pieces, I hear people say, oh, well, it's just this one project we're working on, or it's just this city. And when as we were reaching out to different organizations and individuals doing this kind of work, we learned so much from the local innovators. And so all of those stories add up and they really matter. And so I would just throw that in there as well, because often, you know, when I think about change, there's like that bell curve. So you've got like the people over here who always want to do everything first, and then there are people in the middle, and then there are people who like still have the flip phones, and they're like, I don't ever want an iPhone, keep it away from me, you know, until they can't buy another flip phone. And that's, I think, you know, you think about change and you think about innovation, and it's like that across the board. And so the early innovators really help move that forward. And a lot of the work that I know is going on at the local government that you guys get to be part of is part of that.
Any questions show up online? Any questions in the room? Yes.
Question.
Talk so fast.
In one of the projects we're doing, we're looking at Yolo County's climate action plan, which is its own plan separate from like a general plan or anything like that. And we're finding that it usually leads to making it harder to implement because it's not really at the forefront of the county's attention, and it also doesn't automatically give it any funding if it were to get funding, if it was automatically included in the operational plan. So do you have any recommendations, since we're supposed to be giving them recommendations on how to more easily incorporate it? Do you find that putting things in the general plan aligns goals and budgets more easily?
Well, I mean, I'll make a general comment. I mean, part of it is about political will and how the constituents have organized to do these things, because, you know, not just climate action plans, but there's all kinds of plans that are bureaucratic exercises. As someone said, I think maybe Elizabeth said, it's a checkbox, and they move on to the next thing, rather than having a real continuity. building accountability into the plan through measurement, metrics, transparency, reporting requirements. I mean, I live in Berkeley, and probably Berkeley is it's part of that early adopter and way out there. But the last iteration of seeing with Timothy Burroughs, seeing how that's working, these mechanisms are actually built in. But you need a political constituency that says, well, so how are we doing? You said you were going to do this in the plan. What's the measurement? What's the metric? What's the reporting? But ultimately, I think it's more of a political problem. There could be some structural and process issues of how it's integrated into other kinds of plans, and whether it's just, whether it should be incorporated into a general plan or be its own. All kinds of organizations are now, trying to merge their mitigation plan with their adaptation plan. And others are saying, hey, wait a minute, why don't we just have a sustainability plan that incorporates all of these things? So there may be structural things that, I don't know the details of Yolo County, but there may be things that could facilitate it rather than being orphaned, because it sounds like there might be some element of that now. Yeah. But, like I said, ultimately it's a political issue, and whether people are organized to move it forward, and there's receptivity in the political class that has to make those decisions.
So if I can add to that, I think it's also a financial barrier in the sense that, and not just what does it cost to do it, but up till now, many of the funding streams have been isolated in terms of where they come from, what they support. So one of the classics is you see over the last couple of years, the utilities have actually done a really admirable job of funding climate action planning, but they only fund the energy portion. So they're funding all these energy action plans, which are like a one-legged stool. Mm-hmm. And where are you going to go get the rest of your climate action plan done? And now you add the vulnerability assessment and the adaptation planning, and you got to go where you've got the money for it. Right. You can't, always prescribe. And I think the state, again, is starting to look at that pretty seriously and thinking about how do we connect the dots between some of the funding streams, with cap and trade, or between other funding streams. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, this is something we talk about a lot, is how you message climate change work in different parts of the state, since Civic Spark is a statewide program. So, Yolo County, for those of you on the phone up in the Sierra Nevada region, public health is actually a great tool to access climate change work. So sometimes, there are definitely parts of the state where, and I can say this working for the state, where we know that if we go in and say, we're from the governor's administration, we're here to talk to you about climate change, they won't even meet with us. Or they might, but it won't be fun. Whereas what do people like? They like young people, they like each other, they like their locals more than they like the state, they like being healthy or at least not being sick. So Elizabeth and Dr. Maslick have given you a whole new suite of tools and a way to communicate about your issues in a way that sometimes is a lot more effective. So even if, the most staunch Republican with a flip phone may care a lot about their kid with asthma. And so if there's something that they can do to help their kid with asthma or their neighbor's kid with asthma, they're going to be all about it, and it just doesn't have to be called climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was going to say the other thing that might be interesting from just a policy analysis perspective is to actually see what lines up where. So taking the policies that you're trying to prioritize with your climate action plan and looking at your sustainable communities, looking at the different things and seeing where is there some overlap. And where you might be able to move, what strategically could you move forward a little bit easier? Because I think the piece about this is kind of in the future going forward, if more places are starting to overlap climate planning in their general plan, or at least that they're again trying to make sure that they line up. That's going to take time, and so a general plan might not be getting updated, but if there's some things to the extent possible that already exist, that might be helpful.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other comments, questions? Really, really appreciate it. And again, these are recorded, and we will be sharing these with members who weren't able to attend, and sharing the slides, which I know I have a wealth of stuff to pull from. So thank you guys very, very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
And for encouraging us to continue.
This was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And for questions that may not have been able to be answered, I know there's one. We'll try to get them answered by the speakers and send it out via email to everyone. And if you guys have any other questions feel free to email Kristen or myself, Jenny, and we can try to get them answered by the speakers and out to everyone. So thank you guys again, and have a great day.